There's a lot we're going to be covering today, and so I'm going to be keeping things moving along fairly quickly, and hopefully you'll be able to keep up. There's just a lot in here that we're going to be looking at. And remember, I said at the beginning of this study that we needed to begin to look at the book of Daniel from a Christ-centered, redemptive perspective rather than the typical moralistic perspective. And this chapter is one major reason why that is so important. As a matter of fact, when we begin to look at all of Scripture that way, as we'll kind of discover in bits and pieces through here, all of Scripture begins to take on a completely different perspective, and we begin to glean things that are there that we didn't realize God was showing us. And today, we will see, like I say, we'll see even more why that is so important, because without that perspective, our text loses most of its importance. Last week, we looked at Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 4, and we compared the elements of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in this chapter with his dream in chapter 2. In this chapter we read, if you will, "The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. Your Majesty, you are that tree. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky, and your dominion extends to distant parts of the earth." And then in chapter 2, what we had read, if you will, "Your Majesty, you are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed all mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold." So beginning with Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, Daniel made it clear that, if you would, the God of heaven has placed Nebuchadnezzar up and raised Nebuchadnezzar up and made him great. He didn't do this on his own. It wasn't something that he accomplished by himself. And yet we saw the king defy and challenge God in chapter 3 when he told Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, when he threatened them and said, "If you would, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" A challenge directed at God, and it takes a mighty arrogant person to claim superiority over gods, especially over the true and living God who's been revealing himself to that person. This has been Nebuchadnezzar's mindset from the beginning. And even though God has been humbling the king, he has not yet broken and accepted that he is not the one in control. He still thinks that he's defeated the God of the Jews, that he's the top man on the totem pole. He's still not getting this, and even though he's being humbled through the process. Even after seeing Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah rescued from the fiery furnace, we come to chapter 4. Now I want you to understand something. Like I said, there's a lot here we're going to be talking about. And we cannot look at chapter 4 of Daniel with everything that's going on in this chapter and avoid the subject of mental illness. We cannot ignore the fact that, if you would, if Nebuchadnezzar were to be taken to a hospital today, he would at minimum be diagnosed with schizophrenia and would be medicated until he was drooling and be placed in a mental institution to spend the rest of his life without hope. We can't ignore that fact. We cannot go through this passage, even though it ends different from that and starts for reasons other than what we would normally suppose according to our contemporary psychological and psychiatric models, without asking the question, if you would, what does this mean for those of us who have given our lives to Christ and yet live in this real world where people have real problems and real difficulties? Can we just pretend that this chapter isn't here? Well, we can, and not deal with the issue of schizophrenia. After all, that's just God dealing with Nebuchadnezzar, right? Well then, but what about Job? Job is a classic case of clinical depression. Oh, well, we want to skip over Job. We don't want to deal with that. Okay, well, then let's move forward. What about the Apostle Paul's statement, "What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death?" Or when he refers to himself as the chief of sinners. Do you think maybe a lot of what prompted those statements was a result of PTSD? Do you think maybe he had nightmares about the arrests and murders of men, women, and children he'd overseen? You betcha. How could he not be haunted by such a past lived in opposition to God? Oh, but we want to avoid PTSD too? Well, then what about the Psalms? Virtually every form of what would be defined as mental illness is expressed in the Psalms by the psalmist himself. Well, we don't want to go there. Want to avoid it there? Well, let's consider Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as he experiences a classic instance of anxiety. I mean, you may not want to consider that prospect, but remember, if you would, Jesus experienced life just like we do and wasn't exempt from struggling with the same things that we struggle with. Yes, he was God, but he was also human, God in the flesh. You see, no matter where we go in Scripture, we cannot avoid the subject of mental illness because it's there. It's real. And it's in the Scriptures. So even if you want to avoid the subject here in Daniel 4, you have to face it somewhere when you approach the Bible from a Christ-centered, redemptive perspective. When you're approaching the Bible that way, you cannot avoid it. You find it everywhere. And so we find ourselves facing the question, what is the church supposed to do? What are we as followers of Christ supposed to do? Well, there's a few possibilities. We could simply say that we need to let the professionals handle it because we're not qualified. I mean, we could do that. And we can't really support that position because it's in the Bible. So we can't ignore it. Well, we could go to the other extreme and act like we understand things completely just because of what we have in the Bible and how it relates to what's going on in people's minds. But the Bible's not intended to be a mental health textbook, so to speak. So we can't go to that extreme either. So what's the answer? Well, we start by looking at texts like this and talk about the main issues involved there. We look at other texts and we talk about the main issues involved in them. And please understand, I am not going to try to give you an exhaustive understanding of the way the Bible deals with mental illness, or an exhaustive understanding of psychology and psychiatry. That's not my goal, nor would I ever hope to try to. What I hope to do is give you a basic understanding so that we can at least talk about it in a way that honors Christ, recognizes what it means to be saved, and what it means to have the physical and spiritual abiding simultaneously together in all human beings. Now let me give you a full disclaimer here real quick. It is a blessing to be able to contact other ministers and gain insight from their experiences and do online research, and I have to admit, I had a lot of help from multiple sources in developing this message. Okay? Because this is a big topic. And some of the ministers I have been blessed with family practice physicians and psychiatrists and psychologists in their congregations that they could go to and ask specific questions that they could pass on information to me. And because this text and others like it are in the Bible, I knew I needed some additional insight because this isn't my area of expertise. I did not go to the school and study mental illness. Okay? And because we live in a real world with real people, with real problems, and also because it's in the Bible, it's important and even necessary that I come to know something about this as a minister of the gospel of Christ. And it's not an option for a minister to bury his head in the sand and pretend he doesn't see, hear, or know anything when it comes to the issue of mental illness. It simply is not an option, as I've learned. So like I said, it is vital I know something about it. And let me tell you, this has been a real educational and eye-opening journey preparing this message. And I don't believe that burying our head in the sand is an option for any of God's people, because we are called to walk with people who have real difficulties. We are to be the eyes, hands, and feet of Jesus in the community around us, and to ignore it or avoid it would be a dereliction of duty. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but have you ever noticed, if you would, the farther society has drifted from God, the more mental health issues have been on the rise. Consider that connection. That's important to think about. That connects this to the Bible. And dealing with mental health issues has become more difficult. Why? Well, when you have a society that has become more degenerate, if you would, hopelessness becomes the norm. As you begin to look around and see the reactions and the responses of people in society today, you begin to realize that more and more people are living lives of hopelessness. And what naturally follows when hopelessness prevails? Well, despair and a sense of worthlessness increases. Starting to see the connections? So if there is this link, why is it so hard for us to talk about the subject of mental illness as Christians, even within the church? Well, one reason, and I like the term coined by Vodi Basham, is because of our, if you would, psychologized culture. You see, there are commonly held views or presuppositions with which we live that make it difficult for us to talk about this passage or to even think about this passage in the right way. Did you know that the number one most completed class in college is Psychology 101? Almost everybody that goes to college takes Psychology 101. Almost every four-year college grad has had to complete this course. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them. And sadly, at that young age, most young people coming out of that class think they now know psychology. Ever come across any kids like that? They complete a college course and now they think they're experts in the course. Or they get a four-year degree and now they're experts on everything in life, and those who have decades more experience don't know anything. Ever come across those people? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we all know a few like that, don't we? We might even have a few in our own families. Another reason we find it difficult to talk about mental illness is, if you would, the acceptance of psychiatry into the medical community. That has changed the way people think about mental illness and has gone a long way towards psychologizing our culture. A third reason, if you would, overdiagnosis. All of us know someone who has been diagnosed with some type of mental illness. All of us. I could go down a list and it would hit most of us, if not all of us here today, that we know somebody on that list. And almost every one of us would know someone who has been diagnosed with at least one thing on the list, and in some cases, more than one. Just a few examples, beginning with the one that is pretty much most popular today, if you would, bipolar disorder. Followed by, if you would, depression. And then there's, if you would, anxiety disorder or social anxiety disorder known as SAD. And then there's, if you would, ADD, ADHD. And another one that's becoming quite popular and quite to the forefront now is, if you would, PTSD. And of course, the ever-present, if you would, chemical imbalance disorder. All of us probably know somebody with one of those diagnoses. Some of us may even be one of those. I don't know. Another reason we find it so difficult, if you would, the drug commercials. Have you noticed the constant flood of commercials promoting drugs for treating mental illness? You know, they basically say, where does depression hurt? It hurts everywhere. And the myriad of others. We have been subtly convinced to believe that mental illness is a new norm. I mean, think about it. Movies and TV, for instance, TV, police dramas where the psychologist is the one who knows everything about the suspect they're looking for, even though he's never met the person. Why? Because somehow we have come to believe, without realizing it, that the psychologist is all-knowing. I mean, you've seen the shows. This person, they're in this meeting, and they're going through, and they're saying, well, this person is probably this age and grew up under these circumstances, and they go down the list and paint the profile of what to look for, and the whole time the police sitting there can't see it, and the show is showing it to us as it's being described. And what is taking place is we are being conditioned to believe, if you would, the person with the psychology degree is God. He knows everything. Still, another reason it is difficult to talk about it is, if you would, destigmatization. Easy for me to say. I mean, there really isn't a stigma attached to mental illness anymore like there was, and I'm not trying to say that a stigma is good or bad, okay? But there used to be a stigma that no longer exists. And now so many people seem to be proud of their mental illness. Have you noticed that? I mean, think of the number of celebrities who are coming out and talking about their mental illness, and they're talking about it, and it's like they're wearing it like a badge. I mean, even the general public follows suit. I mean, think about it, if you would. People won't tell you their phone number, but they will tell you their diagnosis. I know some people like that. As soon as you start a conversation with them, next thing you know, they're talking about their diagnosis. Oh, I've got this, and I'm dealing with that, and even online, posting their thoughts of depression and anxiety and everything else, and finding memes to accompany the post. It's all over the place. This has become a psychologized culture. Also, if you would, there has been a marginalization of the church in relation to the discussion of mental illness. Why do I say that? The overwhelming majority of ministers who have any theological training have basically been given this kind of instruction when it comes to mental illness and mental disorders. It says, if you would, if someone has a small problem, you can help them. If they have a big problem, call the professionals. Do you understand what they're saying? Do you understand what's at the heart of that teaching? What they're basically saying is, if you would, God cannot handle mental illness. Call the professionals. And ministers are taught that. Christians are taught that. We've grown up believing that. If somebody has a little problem, we'll sit down, we'll talk to them, we'll help them. But if they got a big problem, send them to a professional. Because God can't handle mental issues. And we believe it. We don't want to admit it, but we do. We prove it by our actions and our approach to people and problems and mental illness. Think about it. Don't we have a tendency to kind of pull away from people like that sometimes? Because we don't know how to handle it. We don't know how to deal with it. Because we have marginalized the church in the discussion to the point that our approach is, I just can't handle it. I mean, we will run to a mental health professional to get treatment, and many times get put on psychotropic drugs and not even consider consulting a minister. Because the church has been marginalized to the point that our approach is none of his business, not his area. His job is to tend to the spiritual, and therein lies the problem. The fact that we are trying to separate the spiritual from the physical. And that is a dangerous mentality, and we're going to touch on that for a little bit in a few minutes. Then there is, if you would, the history of psychology. Let me give you just a quick idea of what has happened over the last century, because we could spend a lot of time just talking about this. See, we tend to believe that psychiatry and psychology are sciences like chemistry and physics. Now, this was a big eye-opener for me. See, we believe when somebody says you have a chemical disorder, for instance, or imbalance, that what has actually happened is they have given you a test, and they have tested the level of chemicals in your body, and because of that scientific test, they know that you are outside of range. We think about it like blood pressure. The systolic must be in this range, and the diastolic has got to be in this range, and if they're not, then you have either high blood pressure or low blood pressure, because we've done this scientific test. We know what the range is supposed to be. And we think about chemical imbalance in the same way because we assume that these people are doing science. Well, what I found out, and what most Christians don't know, is that there is no such thing as chemical imbalance. There is no test for it. Never has been. Everybody's chemistry is different. It isn't like blood pressure. There is no way to establish a standard like blood pressure and say if you're not in this range when it comes to the chemicals in your brain, then there is an imbalance. I learned this from one minister who had a dear friend who had as a family member being treated for chemical imbalance and almost lost a friend over this. They were visiting, and somehow in the conversation he alluded to that fact that there is no such thing as chemical imbalance. His friend became very upset, and they started arguing. The discussion became very intense, and the friend even called his friend, who happened to be their family physician, who was treating the family member. The minister said you could see the guy's countenance change as the physician explained to him that what he was being told was true. There is no test for it. It doesn't actually exist. You see, how it is diagnosed is the person has a conversation with a psychiatrist about how they feel and how they function, and then they're drugged. And if that drug doesn't work, then they are prescribed a different drug or a cocktail of drugs, and so on. It's no wonder we have a drug problem in this world today. Everywhere you turn, we're being told the solution to our problems is drugs. Starting to get the picture? If you look at the history of psychology, you see a movement from one paradigm and model and worldview of psychology to the next, to the next, to the next. Why? Well, we start off believing a certain school of psychology, and then we find out it doesn't really work, and then we move on to the next one, which is supposed to be the newer, bigger, better, and then that one doesn't work, and so we move on to another one, to another one, to another one. And most people don't even realize how these diagnoses come about in psychology. Now, we've already established that there is no testing that can be done. So, how do they come to these diagnoses? If you would, they vote. The psychological community meets. They talk about groups of symptoms that they see. They give it a name, and then they vote on it. And if enough people in the meeting agree, then it gets into the diagnostic and statistical manual, and it becomes an official diagnosis. Why is that important? That is the only way to get insurance companies to pay for it. And that's the long and short of it. Can you imagine on voting whether or not a heart attack is a heart attack? Or a stroke is a stroke? Can you imagine taking a poll as to whether someone has high blood pressure or not? Can you imagine a surgeon opening you up and removing things, hoping it solves your problem? Imagine you go into surgery and they remove your gallbladder. You regain consciousness and they say, well, if you don't feel better, then we'll go back in, we'll take something else out. Your appendix maybe, or perhaps one of your kidneys. We'll keep going until we get it right. No, we wouldn't tolerate that, would we? But in the mental health community, we don't even question it. And that's a massive problem. And I'm not arguing that psychiatry and psychology are useless, but there are problems. Let's look at them quickly, and then we'll look at Nebuchadnezzar and see the connection and implication of these things. First, if you would, it's quasi-scientific. Psychology, psychiatry, quasi-scientific at best. And that's a problem, because it leads to the second problem, that is, if you would, the lack of accountability. For instance, if a surgeon goes in and takes out the wrong thing, they get sued for malpractice. They were supposed to run tests, get images, scans, and know exactly what they were doing and know what they were taking out. They remove the wrong thing, you're in trouble. They make a mistake, you die, they're in trouble. But if a psychiatrist, based on a syndrome that was voted upon by another group of psychiatrists, gives you a diagnosis and then gives you a drug, and then as a side effect of that drug, you go and commit suicide, they cannot be sued for malpractice. Why? Because it wasn't a scientific diagnosis. Therefore, they cannot be held specifically accountable when there is no specific thing they are dealing with. They hide behind what is called, if you would, standards of practice. It's estimated that there are as many as 40,000 deaths per year directly related to psychotropic drugs, and yet psychiatrists are not held accountable. 40,000 a year. No one held accountable because they're not actually doing scientific tests. They're not treating actual medical illnesses. And so there's a lack of accountability. And then there's also, if you would, an absence of results. Psychiatry and psychology have never cured anyone of anything, nor they claim to be able to. Never cured anybody. Again, psychiatry and psychology have never cured anyone of anything, nor do they claim to be able to. After all, if you can't diagnose someone accurately with a test to demonstrate what they have, how could you know if you've cured them? And of course, there's a fourth problem, if you would, dangerous side effects. Just listen to the drug commercials. They talk about, prescribing drugs for depression. What is one of the biggest issues of depression? Suicide. And so they're going to prescribe you a drug. And what do they tell you is one of the side effects? You might want to commit suicide. Huh? And there's another issue, and that is, if you would, it's the wrong worldview. Psychiatry and psychology are based on a materialistic worldview that sees nature as a closed system and man basically as a machine. They only recognize and treat the physical side and are not equipped to deal with the spiritual side. They don't even acknowledge it and don't account for it. They can't because it doesn't fit their worldview. Then there are the theological inconsistencies. Thomas Szasz is a psychiatrist who is, you'd say he's at odds with his profession. And I understand some of you might be a little uncomfortable with some of the things that I'm saying because we don't talk like this about psychology and psychiatry. They get a free pass in society today. They aren't questioned. Somebody says you are bipolar, and you're bipolar. Somebody says you have clinical depression, you have clinical depression. Somebody says you have a chemical imbalance, you have a chemical imbalance. No questions asked. Take this pill. Yes, sir. So we're not used to this kind of discussion. So who am I? I'm just a preacher, a Bible teacher. But Thomas Szasz, he's not a preacher. He is a psychiatrist. And he penned the classic, if you would, The Myth of Mental Illness. In it, he refuted the idea that mental disorders were on par with physical illness and could be treated with medication. In his view, if you would, mental illness does not constitute actual disease, but rather problems in living. See the connection? Read that again. Mental illness does not constitute actual disease, but rather problems in living. I didn't say that. Psychiatrists did. I can't say that. That's not my field. I don't have that authority to say that, but he does. And this is what he says about his field, and there is no way to prove anything different. And where are the problems in living addressed? Here. Now please, as we go through this, don't put words in my mouth. If I want to say something, I'll say it, and if I don't want to say something, I won't say it. Don't look for me to imply anything, okay? For instance, I did not say there's no such thing as mental illness. And I did not say all psychologists and psychiatrists are going to hell. And I did not say that nobody has any real problems or that there is nobody outside of the church who can help. I didn't say that. And I'm not saying that. But when a psychiatrist says something like what Thomas Szasz has said, we need to sit up and pay attention because it is his area we are trying to understand in light of the Scriptures. But we also need to understand, if you would, that that spiritual health has a lot to do with people's problems, people's problems, and they deal with them. And whereas I and other ministers recognize these psychiatrists and psychologists in the discussion of mental health, the vast majority of them do not recognize us in the validity of the impact of the spiritual on mental health. So, from that perspective, they're out in left field as far as I'm concerned, because they don't have the whole picture. Not because I'm anybody worth recognizing, not because this is just worth recognizing. It demands recognizing. It's in the Bible. So let's dig into the text and look at Nebuchadnezzar. And remember, Daniel warned the king in the section we looked at last week. Okay? Warned the king in the section we looked at last week. Daniel 4:24. This is the interpretation, Your Majesty, and this is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and will live in the wild, live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like an ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. This is not God telling Nebuchadnezzar what is going to occur naturally to him because of a defect in his brain. If you would, this is what God is going to do to him. Remember that. And then also remember Daniel's warning, Daniel 4:26. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, Your Majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue. The warning is connected directly to Nebuchadnezzar's sin, his pride and refusal to bow the knee before God, and his defiance of God. This is what is going to happen because you refuse to bow the knee and you challenge and defy God and exalt yourself above him, is basically what Daniel's telling him. That's it. Period. You keep blaspheming God, and this is what's going to happen. So here in Daniel, we see a direct link between sin and mental illness. And by mental illness, I use that in the general term the way we all understand, which we'll kind of look at a little bit. A direct link between Nebuchadnezzar's sin and what would in a hospital or doctor's office today be diagnosed as schizophrenia. What does that mean? That everyone has a sin issue who has this problem? That someone has mental illness and so they've got some sin that's lingering out there? No, I'm not saying that. But in general, the answer is yes, of course, in that we live in a fallen world, and all illness is a result of sin and the curse God pronounced in the garden. But does that mean everyone who is struggling with mental illness is struggling as a direct result of a specific sin they have committed? I can't say that. But you also cannot say what psychology and psychiatry say, and that is, if you would, people cannot say that, you cannot say people are not struggling with mental illness because of a sin problem. You can't take that position. It's what you can't say. But I would never say that everyone who has whatever symptoms they are dealing with, that it is related directly to a particular sin they have committed. I mean, some mental illness is caused by injuries that cause brain damage or by the actions of others, such as various forms of abuse or because of something they've witnessed. You know, it's still a sin issue, but not the sin of the individual suffering from mental illness in those types of cases. But we need to understand, if you would, all illnesses are a result of sin in the world. All suffering is a result of sin in the world, including mental illness. But psychology and psychiatry are arrogant enough to ignore and disqualify the spiritual dimension of humanity altogether. Boy, this keeps cutting out on me. Don't know why. And so, it's usually never even considered in treating mental illness. So let's look at what happened. Daniel 4:28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. He said, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven and until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails were like the claws of a bird. This was 12 months later. I mean, when he originally had the dream, I mean, he was probably scared and changed his ways for a while, but nothing happened. And his heart was unchanged. And so he probably went back to his old ways, and then 12 months later, he's on the top of his palace. And he says, if you would, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? Look what I've done. Look how powerful and great I am. Even after Daniel encouraged the king to heed his advice when he interpreted the second dream. Even after Daniel had pointed out to him that it was God who put him in that position. It was God who raised him up. But as far as Nebuchadnezzar was concerned, he didn't need anyone, including God. Look what I have done. You know anyone like that? I've met a few. I even worked for a person like that several years ago. He couldn't accept that there could be a being superior to mankind and therefore superior to himself. So, as soon as Nebuchadnezzar was speaking the words of self-glorification, a voice from heaven reaffirms what had been foretold in his dream 12 years before. And if you would, immediately God's judgment fell on Nebuchadnezzar, and he became like an animal. Nebuchadnezzar was saying, look at me. Look how great I am. Look at what I have accomplished. Look how powerful I am. And God says, you think you're great? You think you're greater than me? For the next 7 years, I'm making you act like an animal, and you are going to eat grass until you acknowledge that I am in control and that I am God. And immediately he is struck down with mental illness. If you would, because his pride and defiance was extremely large. His humiliation was extremely significant. He was totally and thoroughly humiliated before all of his subjects, before all of the nations he ruled over. Let's look at his symptoms. Daniel 4:33, if you would. Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. He's gone. He's living in the woods. No personal hygiene, out of his mind. Eating like an animal. Bugs, grass, whatever he can find. Picture in your mind if this would happen today. Nebuchadnezzar is out in the woods like this, and his wife goes to a hospital or doctor and asks, could someone come check on my husband? Well, what's wrong with him? Well, he's lost his mind. Okay, ma'am, that's kind of broad. Can you be more specific? Yeah, he lives in the woods and eats bugs and grass. Oh. Immediately they would go get him, then a team would be assembled, and what would the world view of that team be? If you would, naturalistic materialism. Nature is a closed system, and everything we know from our observation in nature, and there is no spiritual connection. That's the worldview that guides the team. It's not a biblical theism, but a naturalistic materialism. And what is their anthropology? If you would, man is the result of evolutionary processes, and ultimately, though there may be a mind-body connection, it's all physical. And that's their doctrine of man. There's a mind-body connection, but it's all physical. They don't see him as being both physical and spiritual dwelling side by side. They don't see the world as having a supernatural spiritual component and a God. Therefore, they don't see man as having a spiritual component that relates directly to God. So what is the team? Well, the primary care physician will first talk to a neurologist who will do a scan and get a picture of the brain to make sure there isn't something there pushing against the brain that's making him act like this, such as a tumor or a blood clot or something. And if there is, then you take the necessary action, get it out, and hopefully things are then taken care of. This is what happens with medicine. But in this case, that's not the problem. So now you get a psychiatrist. Now, a psychiatrist has one tool and one tool only: psychotropic drugs. To a man whose only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You also have a clinical psychologist and a social worker who are going to be involved in the treatment once he's institutionalized. The treatment? A psychotropic drug cocktail so that he can be controlled and given palliative care to maintain him, to keep him from harming himself, and give him some sort of a reasonable expectation of a comfortable life. The outlook? To this team, Nebuchadnezzar has been reduced to a depressed, humiliated schizophrenic with no hope of ever recovering. You see, if you would, cure is not on the table because as far as they are concerned, there is no cure. They cannot even accurately and scientifically diagnose what this is. So here's the question we must ask. We believe in the sovereignty of God, and praise God, He brings Nebuchadnezzar to his right mind. But can you imagine trying to get truth in the gospel through to an individual who is on a cocktail of psychotropic drugs and is essentially a vegetable, who may potentially have some spiritual issues that need to be addressed, which could bring about a healing? I mean, would those psychotropic drugs make it easier to hear and heed and try to comprehend the gospel? I mean, all things are possible with God, would you agree? So, I mean, you might be able to get through to them. But we can't ignore what would be done to an individual in circumstances like this today, can we? And do you notice who is not on the team? If you would, there is no Daniel. And Daniel is the only one who has an accurate diagnosis and any hope for this man to be cured. But he would not be allowed on this team. He would not be consulted because his worldview doesn't fit with their worldview. Now keep in mind there's some doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists who do have the right worldview and strive to address the spiritual along with the physical, but they are few and far between. Those individuals are the exception. They think that way in spite of their training. But most of them didn't even begin applying the biblical worldview at the beginning of the practice, even though they may have already been Christians. Most of them had to come to the realization that the biblical worldview had to be applied somewhere along the way. Now, it's very important, because just because someone who is a Christian is a psychiatrist or a psychologist does not mean they are applying the Christian worldview to their profession and understand the importance of treating people from that perspective who have mental illness. They may not know anything about how to apply the biblical theological reality to the treatment of mental illness. All they have is their training. And they won't put a Daniel on the team. So what is my point? You have to put a Daniel on that team if you or a loved one are struggling with mental illness. You have to address the spiritual as well as the physical. You cannot separate the two. Now please understand, I'm not saying that you get right with God and all of a sudden everything is good and okay. Doesn't happen that way. But remember, it was going to take Nebuchadnezzar 7 years with Daniel on his team. So it's not an overnight fix, but it is the beginning of getting at the heart of what the real problem is. Also, I'm not saying it is wrong to help people and relieve their symptoms with medication where and when we can. That's mercy and kindness. I mean, if we can help someone not run around eating grass, then we need to help them, but we have to understand that these things need to work together. We cannot drug people to the point that they cannot comprehend the spiritual connection to their problem. We cannot leave the spiritual out of the treatment of mental illness and take a totally physical, naturalistic, materialistic approach. Even in regular medicine, doctors are beginning to realize you cannot leave out the spiritual connection even to physical healing. That those with a strong faith in God tend to recover from illness and injury faster than those who do not. There has to be a balance in the treatment. And I am by no means suggesting that I am the one who knows for certain where that balance lies. But we need to remember that there is restoration. Daniel 4:34. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified Him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as He pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back His hand or say to Him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything He does is right and all His ways are just. And those who walk in pride He is able to humble. Nebuchadnezzar lifts his eyes to heaven. In other words, he is finally broken and recognizes that God is God. And then his sanity is restored. It took years. But when he reached the point of being broken and acknowledging God is God, his sanity was restored. When he finally dealt with the spiritual side of things, his sanity was restored. It was difficult. I can guarantee you it was painful for everyone. But in a profession with a worldview that offers no hope of cure, when the spiritual is applied to the treatment of mental health, if you would, there is renewed hope. It's a beginning. People need to know that in Christ Jesus there is restoration, there is purpose, there is self-worth, there is hope. To Jesus, each individual is worth dying for. To Jesus, each individual has value. To Jesus, each individual is important and loved. And the world needs to hear that message, and we need to give that message to the world, completely believing it with all of our hearts, that what we are saying is true, because it will be reflected in our actions if we believe it or not. And understand that when the spiritual is applied to the treatment, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden everything is great. But what it does mean is that hopelessness is replaced with hope. That things can get better. And without the application of this, the prognosis is hopeless. But with it, there is hope. Remember what we've been saying from the very beginning, if you would. We don't need Babylon. Babylon needs us. God's people somehow need to be re-engaged into the discussion of mental illness and begin to bring the spiritual and the physical back together in the diagnosis process so that there can be hope in a world that is being flooded with hopelessness. We don't need Babylon. They need us. They need this. They need God. They need Jesus Christ, the one who can restore all things. I'm not saying that it's always going to bring about a cure, that all of a sudden everything will eventually be right. But I do know this from the examples I see in the Scriptures over and over again, it will get better. When there's hope, things get better. I think one of the best ways to perhaps view this issue of mental illness is to realize that these people are bound. They're trapped. Who's got the keys? Jesus. It's not easy to come alongside someone who's struggling like that. It means we have to step out of comfort zones. And it means we have to truly love people the way Jesus loved people. Maybe you're bound with something today. Maybe there's something that has you feeling like maybe you're in a prison of some kind. Bring it to Jesus. He is the one who restores all things. Do you have some decisions you need to make today?